The lessons of the past are too narrow. So not only do you have anti-Semitism as the only lesson, not only do you have the mislearning of this lesson and application in a way that now is directed towards migrants, right? You also have the total diplomatic cover for Israel and its campaign in Gaza in the name of the Nazi past, or overcoming the Nazi past, which is exposing German diplomacy to international ridicule.
In this podcast, we are trying to discuss difficult questions. For example, should the Holocaust be understood as unique or in the context of a broader history of colonial conquest, of genocide and racism? And how can and should we remember these crimes? In 1986-87, Germany's most well-known post-war intellectual, Jürgen Habermas, attacked conservative historians who believed that Germans should move on from a, quote, negative myth of Nazi Germany. Against this view, Habermas argued that only the memory of the Holocaust as uniquely evil could create a new moral German identity and foster a flourishing democracy. Habermas' vision became reality over the next decades. It's what I learned at school, what politicians would say in speeches, what I read in books and newspapers. It's also what I heard at home when I asked about the past. Today, however, some historians argue that Habermas' vision of a progressive German memory culture has turned toxic, giving rise to a new form of German nationalism. They say that this memory culture excludes those, often people who migrated to Germany, who don't treat the Holocaust and its remembrance as the core of their identity, but rather place it into their own historical reality of Western colonialism, racism, and oppression. But this goes against Habermas' understanding of the Holocaust as a Zivilisationsbruch, a rupture with an otherwise progressive Western civilization. The most prominent voice of this argument is Professor Dirk Moses. So we thought that we should talk to him.
Dirk is also one of the world's leading scholars of genocide. The concept of genocide has become more prominent in both the public and legal discourse, not least because South Africa has accused Israel of genocide in front of the International Court of Justice. Dirk, like many others, has called out the genocidal language used by Israeli leaders. But he thinks, rather than focusing on genocide, which is incredibly hard to prosecute, we should instead condemn the security thinking that leads states to destroy entire groups of people. This is the argument of his new book titled The Problems of Genocide. For me, a lot of the curiosity to talk to Dirk Moses sprang out of this tension between, on the one hand, the hope and energy that is invested in and projected onto international law, and the concept of genocide specifically, and the limits of these structures and concepts to practically bring about change in Palestine. It's a fascinating and challenging conversation. You can find all of the references to books and articles in the show notes, and we hope you will enjoy this episode.
Hi, Dirk.
Good to be here.
Let us go back in history and start with the origins of what we today know as genocide. Where does the concept of genocide come from? And what was the context in which it originated?
Sure, happy to. As some of you may know, I wrote a book about this, which was published in 2021, called The Problems of Genocide, which is part a critique of the concept and how it functions in international affairs, but in part also a genealogy, a history of how and why it came to be coined during the Second World War by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish-Jewish jurist who was in exile in the US. So why did he invent this concept? Humanity has lived without a concept of genocide for thousands of years. Other terms were used to name what effectively genocide was trying to name. massacre, extirpation, and really the destruction of nations and peoples. That's what he was getting at. But there was a discourse about the destruction of nations, and then that kind of language was used for hundreds of years, and very much in the 1920s in relation to, say, the Armenians. Of course, the genocide term wasn't used at the time. People didn't say the Armenian genocide. They would say the massacre of the Armenians, the destruction of the Armenians, the Vertreibung, expulsion of the Armenians. So the reason he came up with this is because there was an international debate about the coming war crimes trials. So by the early 1940s, the Allies had determined, eventually they would win the war. No one knew really when. Would it be 1945, 1950, 1955? But eventually there would be a victory, now that the Soviets were activated as well. And the question was, what laws would you prosecute the Nazis and their collaborators with? And let's not make the mistakes that we made at the end of the First World War, where there were prosecutions of Ottoman and German officials, but it basically failed because you left it to them to prosecute their own people, which didn't really happen seriously. So you wanted an international ad hoc tribunal, which is what the Nuremberg trials were, an ad hoc, one-off tribunal. It wasn't a permanent criminal court like we have with the ICC. And then, what laws would they use? And international law was pretty limited at the time. The concept of crimes against humanity had been introduced during the First World War, but as a diplomatic term, not as a legal term. And there were the Hague regulations based on the Hague Conventions of 1889 and 1907, which governed the occupation of peoples. You can't transfer your civilians in, theirs out. You can't exploit their resources. You sort of have to maintain the status quo. And these are the laws that apply along with others, for example, in the West Bank. Okay, so they're still valid international law. But Lemkin's point was that the Nazi project was so radical that these laws didn't capture that, and they didn't capture the destruction of nations, which was a Nazi aim, and that included not just Jews, but the Polish people as a nation, Czechoslovaks, etc. So Lemkin devised a very broad concept of genocide, the destruction of nations, that would include the fate of the Polish nation and the Jews across Europe, who were citizens of all these different nations, right? And he also, as a nationalist himself, had a very broad concept of what constituted a nation. A nation wasn't constituted solely by the lives of its members, in a biological sense, but also by its national institutions, national spirit, and nationalists like him, and this is very common at the time, would talk about, say, the soul of the Jewish people, the soul of the Polish people. We talk more about culture today, but this kind of romantic language was common at the time. So protecting a national spirit, if we want to use that language, was also part of nationness, right, or protecting nationhood. And he wanted to capture that in his very broad definition of genocide. So it would do two things. It would protect, or it would criminalize the attack on nationness, nationhood, very broadly defined in all its dimensions, if you like. And it would help unite in suffering Jews and Christians so that Jews would be noticed and protected by the Allies. When they thought about what the Nazis were doing, it was Jews and Christians being attacked together. So there was a kind of political imperative there as well.
As you just mentioned, Raphael Lemkin's understanding of genocide was much broader than the definition of genocide that the UN adopted in 1948. For Lemkin, genocide as a process in which one group of people destroys another group of people was closely related to settler colonialism. Why did Lemkin think these two processes, genocide and settler colonialism, together?
So he didn't use the word settler colonialism, but he did talk about settler and colonization. So what he observed, along with many other commentators in Europe at the time and in the US, is that the Nazis were engaged in a number of things, and one of them was settling ethnic Germans in Slavic spaces and removing Slavs, Poles, Czechoslovaks, Ukrainians, Belarusians, etc., in creating this large extensive German Empire. So there was an große Völkerverschiebung, and in the Generalplan Ost, which was never ultimately implemented in its full ambition, up to 40 million Slavs were meant to die in forced famines, and they were to be replaced by Germans, on the periphery of Europe, who would be sort of pioneering colonists. And Hitler explicitly referred to the experiences of past empires, both the blue water empires of the British, the French, and so forth, but also the large land empires of the Eurasian continent, as exemplars of what could be done. But this would be done in a modern scientific way by the Nazis. They would perfect and radicalize, not just copy, but take to another level the examples of the past. And I go into some detail about Hitler's sort of imaginings in that way in this book, The Problems of Genocide. So he and other Germans understood the Nazi project as an imperial project, which meant expansion. But within that imperial space, you would then start settling Germans from the core German lands into the periphery, and they become agricultural colonists and so forth. So Lemkin, like others, is aware of this, as I said, and he observed that the immediate destruction, mass killing of other peoples as in the process of conquest wasn't the only way of committing genocide. Another one was deporting them and then replacing them with your people and then changing the national pattern of the land. And that looks very much like settler colonialism. So those of us who are interested in settler colonialism, in a book I did in 2004, 24 years ago, on genocide in Australia, an edited book, which I called Genocide in Settler Society, I recruited Lemkin as a theorist of what happens not just within, say, the Nazi Empire, but in other imperial spaces too. So the idea with settler colonialism is that you don't exploit the natives, quote unquote, the natives. The key is the land. You want to put your people on the land and replace one society with another. And you can either deport the people who are living there. If they resist, then you kill them.
Now, equipped with this knowledge on Lemkin and his initial ideas on the relation between settler colonialism and genocide, we want to turn to Palestine-Israel. How can Lemkin's views help us better understand what has been happening in Gaza during the past months?
Lemkin's ideas of genocide is not the law. The law is much narrower, and on purpose, which is also another argument in the book, is that the law was restricted so that states could engage in, if you like, dirty wars and not be legally culpable for genocide. They could attack civilians as collateral damage, ostensibly, but the effect is actually genocidal. Okay, and there's a lot of armed conflicts after the Second World War which fall into that category. This is just one of them, and not even close to one of the biggest. I mean, millions of people died in the Nigeria-Biafra War in the late 60s, right? Millions. And how many people know about that today? And another problem with genocide is that it admits of a yes-no answer. It's either it is or it isn't. And in the end, it's up to the courts. Because it's not only a sociological or historical concept, it's a legal concept. I mean, it is a law. Okay? And that puts those of us who are not lawyers, who are arguing about trying to understand what's going on into a series, places into a series of dilemmas. So, one of the points of this book, The Problems of Genocide, is to argue that what drives genocide-like violence, whether it's crimes against humanity, mass war crimes, or what we call genocide, is actually the striving for permanent security. Dauerhafte Sicherheit, it's in German original. And that means, not just regular security where you confront an immediate threat, but anticipating future threats so that you're attacking entire groups from which a threat may derive. The leaders of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War reasoned like that when they killed Armenian children. There was an infamous interview with, I think, Talat Pasha in a Berlin newspaper where he said, well, we have to kill the Armenian children because they could grow up and then become become dangerous for us. So that kind of reasoning is quite common. Now, Israeli politicians are talking very much in those terms, and the Americans and German leaders are backing them, because Israel has confronted the immediate threat from Hamas that just took a few days. Okay. In fact, if they hadn't let their guard down on the 7th of October, Hamas would never have made it over the border or the fences, right? So, but they're now going a step further and saying never again can Gaza be a space, a region from which a threat like the 7th of October can emanate. Okay? And to do that, we need to, basically lay waste the north, corral people in the south, try to convince the neighbors to take, Egypt and so forth, to take them, make conditions impossible for the civilians, put in a buffer zone, destroy the agriculture, kill as many as necessary, including with large civilian casualties, as an ongoing project. Like there's no sign this is going to end yet. Okay, so, and the evidence for that is overwhelming. We could perhaps have a conversation about why the law is so difficult to apply. That would be a separate conversation.
Your ideas about permanent security have been met with some backlash, especially when you apply it to the Holocaust. Quite a few articles in German newspapers have argued that it is historically but also morally wrong to make sense of the Holocaust in terms of rational security thinking. They argued instead that this was a hate crime, the biggest hate crime, and it was only done because the Nazis wanted to destroy Jews because they were Jews. Why do you think that this is not enough to help us understand Nazi crimes?
I haven't seen a backlash to this argument except in a couple of German newspapers by, your usual suspects, Anti-Deutsche and so forth, who don't know much about history actually. So the argument's been broadly supported, in English language reviews by, in academic journals, okay? Because the evidence is just so obvious in the sources. Now, it's important to understand that it's rational only in the minds of the perpetrator, and that this is a deeply paranoid mentality. I was inspired to go down this track by the writings of Charles Friedlander, the great Israeli historian, who talked about redemptive anti-Semitism. And I extend that to redemptive imperialism. The Nazis wanted an empire to end all empires, if you like, a 1,000-year empire, which would be the, redeeming the German people and be a gift to the world as well. So very much the kind of language that Friedlander invested in the German understanding of redemptive anti-Semitism, I extended to the notion of their empire. In that sense, it's an extension of his work. And it's actually a sentence in his book where he says that for the Nazis, and not for you and me or anyone else, Jews represented an active security threat and needed to be neutralized. That's what got me thinking, okay, we need to explore that. And then I stumbled across the transcripts in the Nuremberg trials with Otto Ohlendorf, where he's asked by the prosecutor, why did you kill Jewish children? He says, well, you have to understand, we weren't just looking to implement normal military security. We wanted permanent security, and these Jewish kids could grow up and become, or try to avenge their parents. Now, anyone who studied colonial history, as I have, which doesn't apply to any of these German critics, right, it would see straight away that reasoning was common on the American frontier and Australia as well, where they talked about Nits make lice. Nits are baby lice, Läusen in German, and so you needed to kill the baby lice to prevent, an outbreak of head lice. So, in other words, you kill Native American children so they don't become warriors and resist the colonialism. And so I could see that this was a common logic among perpetrators and not unique to the Germans. Now, as I said before, it's a misunderstanding of the Nazi project, and those of us who are arguing their connections between the Nazi project and colonialism, to maintain that the Nazism was just a copy of previous colonialism. Certainly the Nazis didn't think of that in those terms, and I don't think it's an accurate depiction. And Hitler consistently said, as I noted before, that we are being inspired by the rise and fall of empires in the past, and we want one that's not going to fail. And so we're going to perfect, if you like, and radicalize, with the capacities of a powerful modern totalitarian state. You didn't have those capacities in 1850 or even 1900, right? And we will be building the greatest empire the world has ever known, and that means we will need to deal ruthlessly with our enemies. And in the Nazi mind, that included a variety of people, obviously Jews, and so there you need to understand why the history of anti-Semitism is very important. No one denies that, right? But it can't just be the only analytic frame. You have to look at the history of ruthless expansionism in world history. That's another analytic frame. So I'm trying to bring the two together. Other enemies of the Nazis was the left generally. In other words, all the people that the Nazis and many other Germans held responsible for the loss of the First World War, the stab in the back legend and all, the Dolchstoß legend and so forth. And systematically they picked them off during the 1930s.
The narrow definition of genocide in international law allows, as you said, some leeway for state violence. How can your concept of permanent security help us make sense of that leeway that is given in international law for state actors to, so to speak, play within the norms of permitted violence? And how do we see that playing out now in Palestine and Israel?
One of the problems of genocide, among many, is that you could argue Israel is not committing genocide, they're abiding by international law. But even if they are, international law does allow the incidental killing of civilians in the course of attacking a military target. And Israel is saying, and its allies are supporting it in doing so, that each of these missiles that they're using is targeted at a military objective, and that, unfortunately, civilians got in the way. Now, each and one could or could not be a war crime, but they're calculated per incident, not as a totality. But however, if you take this campaign as a totality, with the tens of thousands of civilians killed and the utter laying waste of Gaza neighborhoods, we've all seen the videos, right? The effect is genocidal. So that is one of the problems of international law, and it was designed that way, so that states could engage in enforcing military necessity, as they call it, because states wanted and want to retain the sovereign right to engage in what I would call permanent security practices, to ensure that never again, in this case, that Hamas can be a threat, and in doing so, kill tens of thousands of civilians and lay waste an entire territory and get away with it as legal. Now, it's good to see that the ICC has, decided to consider warrants because the entire world, leaving aside Israel's immediate supporters, can see this is totally outlandish. Okay, and however, it's notable that they're not going with the bombing campaign, because they can't get into Gaza to see the effects. I mean, you actually need forensic scientists to go in and then interview the drone operators to see what their calculations were. I mean, these kind of investigations take years, and there have been thousands of these missile strikes and artillery strikes. So, doing one after the other is impossible. So they're going for the starvation plan. Because you can prove that without having to go into Gaza. You have to look at the statements and practices of the Israeli government. And they've alleged, apart from war crimes, the crime of humanity of extermination, which is as close to genocide as you can get. But why the prosecutor went for the crime of humanity of extermination rather than genocide, when they're virtually the functional equivalent, because it's much easier to prove. Because you can argue that it's not inconsistent with a military aim, whereas with genocide, the way it's constructed in law and in concept and conceptually, it's either an intent to destroy a group, or there's a military intent with collateral damage. And if they're mixed, if these intentions are mixed as they are in praxis, then the court, the ICJ, separate court, according to its own precedents, will say then it can't be genocide. It's a very, very high threshold.
I mean, up until now, we have critically talked about the enabling elements of international law for state violence. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that a lot of groups and NGOs advocating for justice for the Palestinian people have rallied around international law. This was especially visible in the global rallying around the ICJ case on genocide that you already mentioned. I guess our question is, do you see if and how such big courts and such big cases like the ICJ genocide case can actually lead to an improvement of the situation of the Palestinian people? And do you see such improvements more in like tight legal norms and tight legal terms, or rather in a more moral realm within the public discourse on Palestine and Israel?
Well, it's all these realms and a political one. I don't see the cases, if they ever make it to proceedings, right, as having an impact in the short or even medium term, because the time lag is too long, right? But the indictments themselves or the proceedings, say by South Africa, have an immediate political effect and place pressure on governments which purport to respect international law to reconsider their, say, arms deals. Like the British have just curtailed some arm deliveries to Israel on the basis of legal advice from their own, in-house lawyers. The Americans are staring that pressure down because they have their own law, which they're ignoring. But it does, it is a lever for advocacy movements to put pressure on states that are delivering weapons and to expose their hypocrisy, right? Now, there's hypocrisy on all sides. I mean, it's a bitter pill for many. For example, Uyghur friends of mine, who have family in Xinjiang province in China, who are rotting in Chinese jails, to hear the Chinese state talk about international law and protecting minorities. I mean, because they're themselves perpetrators of great violence. So are the Turkish state in relation to Kurds and so forth. So, I don't see these things as either for or against the axis of resistance, quote unquote, or the Western side and NATO. They all protect their client states if accused of atrocity crimes with various feeble excuses. Okay? I'm on the side of the victims wherever they come up. And, the point of this book I've mentioned is to show that the concept and law of genocide is as much part of the problem as the solution. And until now, people have thought of the concept of genocide as a tool that victimized groups can use to gain attention. But if you look at the rules of the attention game, if you like, or the recognition game, they're very much weighed against victims because there's an analogization process that goes on. Because the Holocaust is the archetype or ideal type of genocide, that's how it was designed in the 40s, in order to be recognizable as a genocide or legible, somehow it needs to be analyzable with the Holocaust. Now, that was possible with Rwanda, but Rwanda is one of many cases after the Second World War where mass violence against civilians has taken place. But how many of them have been successfully labeled as genocide? I mean, it took decades for the Armenians to get the Armenian genocide recognizable as genocide, and that took since the 70s and the 80s. Tamil groups are trying to do the same for the destruction of Tamil resistance in 2009. I mean, how many people know how many people were killed by the Sri Lankan military there? Lots of similarities with Gaza, by the way. And one thing I say to Palestinian colleagues who are sort of urging me to come out and say this is genocide is I say, what if the ICJ rules it is not? What then? I mean, then what else have you got in your repertoire? The Israelis and their supporters will say, we told you so. This is a military conflict. Civilians got in the way. That's regrettable. We do our best to warn them, this kind of stuff. I don't believe any of it, mind you, but it's firmly believed by Israel advocates that Israel is the most moral army. Yes, there are some bad actors, but on the whole, Some troops are sort of off the leash with these, videos they put on YouTube and so forth. But on the whole, the operational guidelines are within international law and so forth. That is firmly believed by many people in Israel and the US and so forth. And it doesn't matter what you show in terms of evidence that points towards, genocide-like behavior, they won't believe you, right? So I would caution against putting all your eggs in the genocide basket, because it's quite possible that the ICJ in a year or two could rule that it's not genocide. And then what?
A lot of people do believe, or act like they believe, that the Israeli army is committed to international law. This is certainly true here in Germany. A few months into Israel's war in Gaza, high-ranking German politicians still claimed that Israel is not breaching international law. During that time, the German state even increased their weapons export to Israel, while the Israeli army uses these weapons to kill civilians in Gaza. At the same time, German officials have also pushed back against the cases in front of the ICJ and the ICC, which try to prosecute Israeli crimes in Gaza. Why is Germany doing all of this?
Well, as all people listening to this podcast know, the Staatsräson, as it's been called for the last 16 years or so, is to support the security of Israel, and that it's part of Germany's raison d'etat. And this is now being witnessed in this kind of behavior that you're describing. So it's entirely consistent. Hans Kunani wrote a very interesting article in a Dissent magazine earlier this year. He showed that Joschka Fischer used the term Staatsräson already in the late 90s in relation to the NATO bombing of Serbian forces in relation to Kosovo. And there it was universalistically articulated, that is, Germany had a role in confronting genocide-like behavior everywhere. So never again genocide, if you like. But fast forward about 10 years, you have Merkel and the Knesset saying Israel's security is part of, it's ein Teil unserer Staatsräson. It's not it doesn't exhaust it, but it's ein Teil davon. And he's interested in how and why we got from one universalistic to another particularistic conception of it. Now, this is the source of a massive debate that's going on right now, and I've contributed to it. A lot of other people have as well. Why is there this sense that Germany's historical legitimation is contingent upon the security of another state? And I'm happy to talk about that if you want. Studying the speeches of German politicians in the Bundestag each time there's, say, an anniversary for the founding of the State of Israel, as I did last year when they had I think the 75th anniversary, it becomes clear that the German political class, which talks about Jewish life in Germany and in Israel as a gift, as a Glück as well, that Germany's legitimation as a nation state is dependent on the flourishing of quote-unquote Jewish life after the Holocaust, in view of the fact that Nazi Germany had tried to extinguish Jewish life. So it's a kind of a negation. So I call it the replacing of redemptive anti-Semitism, this Friedlander conception of anti-Semitism, by redemptive philo-Semitism. Okay, I think that's perfectly understandable. I'm here as an observer, as an analyst, not as a moralist saying this is good or bad. I just think it actually makes perfect sense that a post-genocidal society would do that, sort of as a Wiedergutmachung, right? Now, we have to then look at the insights and the blindnesses. I think it's perfectly understandable that a political class would negate what its grandparents try to do, and would be shocked by, in pondering, well, what did our grandparents do? They didn't rescue Jews. They either abandoned them or actually participated in persecuting them. Right? Now, but the Nazi project had more to it than just the Holocaust. It was a racial state, to use the language of historians Burley and Ripperman, who wrote a book about this about 30 years ago. It was called the racial state, which is obsessed with eugenics and quote-unquote racial hygiene, and obviously didn't welcome black Germans for the so-called Rhineland bastard. Roma people were being exterminated, gay people were being persecuted. I mean, there was a whole range of outsiders, right? Social and quote-unquote racial outcasts. And this reduction of the Nazi crime to the Holocaust, or limitation is a better word, right? To the exclusion of these other elements of Nazism, has meant that there's, in a sense, been a continuity of these prejudices which fed into the Nazi project, prejudices from the first half of the 20th century, which continue into the Federal Republic. Now, some of them have abated. For example, there's no more persecution of gay and lesbian people. That went on well into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, mind you, and these laws changed quite late. But, there's been some improvement there. But, the recognition of genocide, persecution of Roma took a long time and is pretty minor. There's still reluctance to properly come to terms with colonial crimes, the Herero Nama, for example, the whole restitution issue. And, there's, related to that, this maniacal attack on quote-unquote post-colonialism. Daily, if not weekly, there are articles in the German feuilletons ranting about, post-colonialism as somehow responsible for all the ills of the world and for importing anti-Semitism or mainstreaming anti-Semitism in, academic and artistic circles. So there's an outsourcing of or projection or displacement of the continuities from the negative continuities from the past actually to non-white people. And it's become, in that sense, the German Erinnerungskultur has become a vehicle for prejudices against and racism against non-white Germans and left-wing non-Zionist Jews. In a sense, to that extent, Staatsräson has become a form of state anti-Semitism. Non-Zionist or anti-Zionist Jews are considered enemies of the state, along with Palestinians, who are at demonstrations together. They're marching together, and they're considered enemies of the state because they are defying the Staatsräson. So once again, we're in a situation where an increasingly authoritarian state is marking certain members of the population as enemies of the state and persecuting them as much as they can within the liberal limits. But those liberal limits are straining, as we saw with the violent police dispersal of the Palestino Congress, and then banning Ghassan Abu Sittah from entering the country, and Varoufakis, a former Greek minister. I mean, that's quite extraordinary. What are they so scared of, right? So, a lot of us are watching this with some trepidation, and I'm sort of pondering, so how did you get from, the Habermas's view of the public sphere, which was put into practice, because he articulated it in the 60s actually, but was put into practice in terms of historical debates in the Historikerstreit from the mid-80s to the mid-90s. How did that end up with this justification for police brutality?
You tried to answer this question in an essay you wrote in 2021?
Yeah, in May actually, late May.
Titled The German Catechism. First of all, I think it's necessary for you to describe what a catechism actually is, because the origin of this term is a religious one, and this religious language runs through your article. You describe Germany's so-called Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, it's working through the past, as a state-led political religion controlled by high priests, such as Germany's Antisemitismusbeauftragte, its commissioners for anti-Semitism. Why are you using a theological lens to make sense of German memory politics?
Well, I wrote that in a weekend, so pretty quickly, after seeing how Achille Mbembe had been treated in the second half of 2020 and the hysterical reactions to the translation of Michael Rothberg's book on multi-directional memory, and then an essay that he wrote with Jürgen Zimmerer, the historian, German colonialism in Africa at the University of Hamburg, in Die Zeit a few weeks before. And, it's all very well to have a robust debate. I mean, people can't be wallflowers. If you're entering the public sphere, you've got to be prepared to, it's a bit like rugby, right? It's a contact sport. I know you don't play that in this country, but I grew up playing that. So, you can't be a wallflower. However, these German commentators went much further, denounced people as anti-Semites. And here you had, descendants of, if you like, the perpetrator generation lecturing Michael Rothberg, a Jewish American, about the correct form of Holocaust memory. And then I asked myself, really, where do they get that sense of entitlement from? Because it's not just the content, it's also the form. There's denunciation, there's tirades, and an attempt to morally disqualify people from being able to speak in the public sphere. So this went beyond rugby into sort of mortal, trench warfare. And, then I looked more carefully, because I'd, written a book about German memory culture in 2007, but kind of looked at other issues like global genocide since then. But I saw that things had changed a lot in the intervening 14 years, and that you had all these anti-Semitism commissioners, none of whom were Jewish, except one convert in Hamburg. And they were going around telling non-Zionist Jews to button it, or to go back to Israel, or, be sensitive to German sensibilities, as Felix Klein put it. And I scratched myself, and I wasn't the only one, thinking, what is going on here, And these are the people that I would like to refer to as high priests. I mean, I use the term catechism and not commandments to indicate this is a very Christian and not Jewish operation, and that my interest here is in Christian German or secular Christian German members of the political class, politicians, journalists, state officials, and so forth, who are telling people how to think, which really violated my very Anglo-Saxon sense of liberty, which is, we have liberalism is deeply rooted in places like Australia, and, sensibility that state officials can't tell you what to think. It's slightly different in Germany, where, there's an Obrigkeit, respect. That's sort of a default position among many members of the German population. Not everyone. I think in the working classes actually have much more defiance and cynicism about state power, which I think is quite welcome. It's in people who went to gymnasiums. You have the problem where they're sort of inculcated in the habits of authoritarian personality from sort of bossy teachers and so forth. I know that's a huge generalization, but I've observed it, by spending many years here. And it's something that, won't be articulated in language, but you can see it in people's affects and so forth. The way people respect, police officers, government officials, and so forth. So, those of us who study post-war Germany, as I did in my first book in 2007, we're always asking, when will liberalism finally be institutionalized as this country? And not just in, government agencies or institutions, but also in the affects of the subjects. And, I thought that it was going quite well when I finished this book in 2006. It was published in a year later. But I see that I was wrong to that extent, that there is a sort of a deep authoritarianism that is embedded as a potential in this society, and that it's when harnessed to racism against outsiders, then is in a really dangerous situation. So why, though, this sort of language of religious sensibility? So one was to point out that this is a secularized Christian project, and that there's religious language in the sources. So it's not a theory I bring and impose on the sources, but that I see it there. People talk about the Holocaust Memorial as ein Keinsmal in the AfD circles, right? And liberal commentators would talk about the Holocaust as a Stachel im Fleisch, which is a reference to Jesus on the cross. Habermas talked about in sort of sacrificial terms about the Holocaust as well. He once used as an example of the transaction that takes place between the guilt and atonement and so forth. He referred to a triptych in Colma, a famous church there, where John the Baptist is looking up at Jesus, but looking at he's the sheep, and looking out to the audience to say, I'm not accusing you of genocide, I'm saying look at the sacrifice. But here, I ask myself, what's going on here? Is he saying that Jesus are like the Jews in the Holocaust and that we now must recognize that Jews are sacrificed like Jesus? And in fact, that's what he was arguing. He denies it when I put it to him. But if you look at the text, that's what's being argued. And so I took these and many other signs of religiosity in the sources about Holocaust Aufarbeitung and the Aufarbeitung of National Socialism as a sign that subterranean biblical energies, if you like, are being recruited in these debates. And it's not surprising. This is a deeply Christian society, even if many people are secular. But its institutions and political language is saturated by biblical tropes, as any Christian society would be. So you can't, I think, take a purely secular approach. The sources themselves cry out with biblical and religious language. Now, I could have used the word clerics instead of high priests. Some people misunderstood that and said he's referring to the Jewish high priests in the temple and so forth. I think willfully to distort what I was saying. But no, I'm referring very much to a Christian catechism. A catechism is a list of propositions that you have to abide by to be orthodox, an Orthodox Christian, mainly Roman Catholic. Although we're really talking about secularized Protestantism here. And there were 5 elements, and each one of them, where you need to subscribe to be, in a sense, a fully German subject in the public sphere. I mean, no one cares what you do in private, but if you're going to be in public, like Nemia Hassan running a TV show, you can't violate any of those. And she did, and she lost her job, and she's only one of many. It includes many Jews as well, Jewish people like Nancy Fraser, Masha Gessen, Candace Bright, with her show in Saarbrücken. So these are Jews who are invited, or Jewish people, academics who are invited to Germany, and have an invitation withdrawn, or are here. They don't get the commission at an art gallery or so forth. And now the German Parliament is considering a resolution in which this would be formalized through the institution of a filtering of applications for state money in relation to art and culture and so forth, to make sure there's a loyalty test to Israel. Now, seen from the outside, it's just remarkable that one state would delegate its loyalty, its admission procedures to full membership of the state, whether through formal citizenship or participation in art and culture, by referring to a state in another part of the world. I mean, it's just really interesting that that's happening, and I think academics like myself have a duty to try to explain that. Not in any kind of moralistic point-scoring way, but just, wow, this is really interesting. How do we explain that? Because it's leading to social conflict in this country.
Both in your idea of embedding the Holocaust within the permanent security framework, as well as in your German Catechism article, you basically delve into the comparative analysis of the Holocaust. Now, one of the criticisms of your Catechism article has been that you forced the connection between the question of the singularity or comparability of the Holocaust and the question of the German Staatsräson. In the edited volume by Jürgen Zimmerer, titled Erinnerungskämpfe, there is, I think, right before your contribution, a contribution by Meron Mendel, who makes this specific criticism and writes that these two things, the Staatsräson debate and the singularity debate, can also be thought of separately. More specifically, that the Staatsräson is a political question in the present day and the singularity debate is a historical question. Why do you insist on connecting them?
Yeah. I'm not sure Meron, who I met after he wrote that article, and we had a good chat. It's a perfectly nice chap. I think he misunderstood what I was doing in the catechism piece. He understood me as saying there should be these 5 precepts of the these 5 articles of the catechism, sort of me laying down the law like Moses, the lawgiver, right? But no, it's not that. I'm working inductively. I'm observing the way the German public sphere works and who gets cancelled and why. And I deduced from that if you defy or violate one of these 5 propositions, whether the Holocaust is unique, whether Zionism is a form of racism or is a separate form of prejudice, whether Germany has a special responsibility for Israel, the Staatsräson, right? If you violate one of those, then you will lose your job or your invitation. I mean, these are just incontrovertible facts. And then the rest of the article tries to explain how and why that's the case, and that each of these propositions are actually faulty empirically. So there are various things going on. But the answer to this criticism that you expressed is that empirically, if you question the uniqueness of the Holocaust in this political culture, then you are persona non grata. Now, historically, speaking as a historian and a social scientist, because I now teach in a political science department, obviously the Holocaust had very distinct attributes. I mean, it was, actually a multitude of different campaigns against different communities, ranging from North Africa to Greece to the Baltics to the Far East, in wherever German territory extended or German conquest extended. So we haven't seen, in the context of a world war, right? We haven't seen anything like that since, this kind of grand, a world war context with a multi-continental wide series of projects which amount to, which are in a sense greater than the sum of their parts from the perspective of the victims. Now, but since genocide is informed by this image of the Holocaust, it's its prototype, ideal type, if you like, it's, making the case that something's a genocide is very difficult, to get back to an early conversation. I think a sober analysis would recognize that there are distinct attributes to the Holocaust. So this maniacal debate in Germany about can you compare, can you not compare, which was already occurring during the Historiker strike, and nothing today has been said that goes beyond that was said in the mid-'80s, is kind of an intellectual waste of time. Okay, there's obvious distinct attributes to the Holocaust. More interesting is to zoom out a bit rather, and to say, well, what was going on in this project in the context of global and world history? Right? Here was an example of violent expansionism, in the context of which, there was a paranoid positing of internal and external enemies by the imperial elites, the Nazi elites. And, what can we learn from that today, right? Maybe that violent expansionism is a bad thing. Maybe that the positing of an internal and external enemies and trying to anticipate those enemies in the future is a bad thing. We can draw different kinds of lessons. And what I'm seeing today in the German context, but not just here, is that there's a very limited understanding of what National Socialism was. It was more than an anti-Semitic project. It was definitely that, but it was a racist project. It was a project of violent expansionism, of ruthless extractionism, and prejudice against an elimination of all kinds of enemies. And a lot of those prejudices are still existing in the society. And now they're being mobilized, say, against Muslims and others in the name of overcoming the Nazi past. So there's this rather deadly dialectic here where, in the name of overcoming the Nazi past, we actually advance some of the projects in the first half of the 20th century about national purity and so forth. that were recruited by the Nazis. Now, I want to make it clear so people don't quote me out of context. I'm not saying that the Federal Republic is like Nazi Germany. It's a little more subtle than that. But, you know, to see German politicians get on TV in the last few days and say all the problems that we have in Germany now can be laid at the feet of migrants who don't look like us, wow. People don't hear echoes of the past in that. I'm not necessarily saying the Nazis, because there are a lot of nasty right-wing politicians in the Weimar Republic, right? If people can't see echoes of the past there, then they're not really looking properly or listening properly.
But just to go back to the specific point of criticism, in how far does this necessarily connect to the Staatsräson debate?
Well, the Staatsräson debate is a manifestation or concretization of, you know, the lessons of the past. And the lessons of the past are too narrow. You know, so not only do you have anti-Semitism as the only lesson, right? I mean, I think that is a necessary lesson, incidentally. I'm not denying, but although it's misapplied, not only do you have the mislearning of this lesson and application in a way that now is directed towards migrants, right? You also have, to go back to an earlier question, the total diplomatic cover for Israel and its campaign in Gaza in the name of the Nazi past, or, you know, overcoming the Nazi past, which is exposing German diplomacy to international ridicule. I mean, when Germany approached the ICC with a petition to postpone the issuing of the warrants, because on spurious grounds that the ICC didn't have jurisdiction in Gaza, or that you needed to wait to let the Israelis prosecute their own people rather than the ICC step in. You know, this was not taken seriously by international lawyers in this country as well as abroad, and it was clearly seen as partisan and just naked diplomatic cover, during which, you know, the arms industry here could profit. So it's not just an emotional, affective, or symbolic relationship. There's also a material one. I mean, you speak to enough people who spend time on aircraft between Germany and Israel, as I have. Yeah, you'll say, oh yeah, you'll hear people say, I was on a Lufthansa flight to Tel Aviv the other day. It was full of high German officials who were going to speak with Israeli officials about arms deals, security cooperation. I mean, there's deep state connections here, which are not going to be undone just because some allegations of violations of international law. I mean, the way states operate is that, well, these controversies will pass eventually. There'll be another conflict, you know, next year, and we want to keep these relationships. And these accusations of war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide are just an irritant. They're just an irritant for the Foreign Office and for other members of the German deep state, and we just want them to go away. And, you know, and these are people who then in the next speech, if they're politicians, will get up and talk about how great the Nuremberg trials were, and you know, we've learnt the lessons from the past and so forth. But they're hard geopolitical lessons, and they use morality as a garb to clothe it in.
The way you have described this catechism to play out is as a set of rules that are rooted in an elite, whether that's in the state or in the media or in the cultural sphere.
Yeah, it's about 30% of the population of the German political class, people who went to a gymnasium, cosmopolitan Germans in inverted commas. That is, it simply means people who care about what non-Germans think about them. I mean, about 70% of the German population don't care. They really don't care what other people think, for better or worse. And they're the ones that, in the opinion polls show, disapprove of Israel's conduct in the war, and they don't trust the German media's reporting of it.
Yeah, this was my next question. You foresaw that one. Do you think that the high indifference or even dislike within the German population of these rules goes against your argument, or does it actually prove that there is an authoritarian tendency in this?
Yeah, I think it enhances it, it bears it out. I mean, it's very important to disaggregate populations. There's no such thing as the Germans or the Israelis. These are complex societies which are riven with conflict and tensions along regional, class, ethnic, and other lines. Okay, any sensible analysis would recognize that. People who talk in terms of national collectives, are really engaging in myth making. So it's clear that German public opinion, as also American public opinion, is unhappy with this war, in some ways outraged by it, and would prefer it to stop, and would prefer it if their governments didn't supply arms. But they do. They do keep supplying the arms and keep giving diplomatic cover. And how do you explain that? Okay. It's not because of some powerful Jewish lobby. I mean, that there's a sort of paranoid, conspiratorial views to which I don't subscribe. Although obviously the Israeli government is looking for support, as any government in its situation would. Right? This is just normal international relations. But the German government has an interest in this behavior, which interests us. Now, I didn't give you a full answer to the religious element before, because there were so many issues to discuss. I was referring to those speeches in the German Bundestag where German politicians sort of praise, Israel's achievements over the decades and the German contribution to them. And what's clear in reading them when they refer to, the Glück and blessing of Jewish life in Germany and in Israel is that this is for them a warrant that Germany is now on the right side of history. They're standing with the Jews, not against the Jews, quote unquote, because I don't believe in those categories, right? And to that extent, Germany's historical legitimation has been regained. It was lost because of the Holocaust. It's interesting, even conservative politicians like Mautz talk in those terms. Whereas someone like Ernst Nolte, 20, 30 years ago, along with other conservatives, wouldn't have said that the Holocaust delegitimated German nationality. They said, well, they had all these excuses. The Russians were to blame, or the Soviets, and they were the real instigators of mass violence in the 20th century. The Nazis were just responding to it, according to that argument. But it's interesting to see conservatives today buy into basically the left-wing arguments of people like Fischer and so forth in the 90s and say, this was a Bruch, a Zivilisationsbruch, an idea from Dan Diener, and that we can only, in a sense, revive German nationality and make it a legitimate project, have its own reason for being, if you like, a raison d'etat, or raison d'etre as well, a Staatsräson, in negating what the Nazis did. So redemptive philo-Semitism. Right? I think this is perfectly understandable. But it's fascinating to see that this trope of redemption come up. And then we're dealing with these religious sensibilities. It's biblical. Is there such a thing as Erbschuld? There's another term that comes up in it. There's no English word for that. Only the Germans have words like this, Erbschuld. Inherited collective guilt is how I translated it, right? Much more clumsy than this lovely, if you like, German or simple, concise German word. And, you just have to open a German magazine like, Stern or Spiegel. Every couple of years they have an article where they interview, Jews and others in Germany about these questions, right? Gibt's so etwas wie Erbschuld? Wann hört das denn auf? With which generation? And it was very interesting to see, about 20 years ago, people when the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe was opened in 2005, which is 60 years after the end of the war? Yes. Yeah. For 1945, 2005. To see that people were thinking, I think that we've done it now. And there's no, we've made this public recognition. And this is, in a sense, where it stops. And, go back to the Bible where it says, the sins of the fathers are visited for 3 generations, I think it is, but not the 4th. I actually end my book with that. So I do think that biblical sensibilities are percolating through these debates. And that's not surprising given that this is a Christian society when, half the country or more went to, did their religious lessons at the Catholic or Lutheran or Calvinist church at some point. So even if they're not professing Christians, the political culture is infused with it.
Okay, to come to our last question before we let you go. You have been a critic of various aspects of the memory discourse here in Germany. we'd like to ask you where you would like the discourse to shift to for a different, or in your eyes, maybe even a better understanding of and learning from the past.
So, I ended that catechism piece in 2021 with a call for a more egalitarian, open memory culture, in which the Holocaust will always be central. Right? It's not as if there should be less Holocaust memory, as people have often willfully misunderstood. People have said, "Oh, he wants to stop us remembering the Holocaust. This is denial. Back to the 1980s or earlier." No, it's not that. It's more memory. We have to bring in more criminal aspects of the Nazi past. And it's when colonial crimes, the memory of the racism against Roma people and so forth. Right? Now, why is it that there are first and second class victims in German memory culture? Why can't they all be victims equally, while recognizing the historical differences? But people can see for themselves what the numbers are. Nearly 6 million Jewish people, right? But if you have a properly historical understanding of how these things work, you can see how the racism and exterminatory energy in the settler colonial project in Namibia, or German Southwest Africa, is part of the same flow of history that is radicalized in the Nazi Empire. So it's not as if, I'm not arguing, I don't think Jürgen Zimmer is arguing that the Holocaust is just, a colonial copy of in this sort of symmetrical, static way that you see from these sort of denialist journalists. Es ist bloß eine Unterkategorie des Kolonialgeschichte. You see that, word bloß is in there often. No one's arguing that. But, if you see history as a series of flows, you'll see that, that the Nazis willfully appropriated that history of exterminatory violence and imperial expansion quite consciously and tried to perfect those lessons. And they did so in relation to a number of groups, obviously first and foremost Jews. Right? But if the radical nature of the Nazi project and its recruitment of German traditions, as well as more general European and Western traditions, was properly recognized, then I think you would have a memory culture which would be reflected in the Gedenkstätten as well, which would reach actually German school children and allow them to understand the world around them much more coherently. And it wouldn't be a matter of sort of fake analogies or flat analogies, or this is like the Nazis, because we're not living in a totalitarian state. There are obviously consequences for free speech, which is what the catechism's about. But, you can still say these things, right? You might lose your job, but you're not going to be put in a concentration camp. So there are obviously massive differences which people need to bear in mind. But, history properly understood and taught and then reflected in public displays like the Gedenkstätten would place these colonial and other crimes that German state committed, as did other colonial powers, right, needs to be acknowledged, in the flow of history that led to the Holocaust. And then people could see, is that flow still with us today? What about Europe's relationship to African states? Is there still an extractive one? I wonder. Okay. Are we still, in this country, as we struggle with in Australia as well, in slightly different contexts, right? Are we still struggling to recognize the full humanity of non-white people, like the Nazis did? And then people can have, I think, a more nuanced as well as full understanding of what the prejudices were that were recruited and radicalized and then institutionalized by the Nazis, also against people with disabilities and so forth.
Well, Dirk Moses, thank you for your answers and for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's good to chat with you.
If you, the listener, has any questions or ideas, please let us know. Our email is in the show notes. That's where you can also find all the books and articles mentioned in this episode. If you want to listen to more conversations about German memory politics and its connections to Palestine-Israel, check out our other episodes.